The envelope felt heavy in my hands, the damning evidence inside. I took a deep breath and opened it, bracing myself for what I knew would change everything. The private investigator's report left no room for doubt. My husband Derek was having an affair and embezzling funds from the company to support his mistress and her child. As I flipped through the pages detailing their sordid rendezvous and lavish expenditures, a sickening mix of anger and heartbreak welled up inside me. How could he do this to us? I whispered, my hands trembling. Derek and I had been together for nearly 20 years, since we were wide-eyed college sweethearts. We'd built a life, a family, a future, or so I thought. Now it was all crumbling before my eyes, the betrayal cutting deeper than any knife. The report identified Derek's mistress as Tiffany, a woman over 10 years younger than me. Glossy photos showed them canoodling at fancy restaurants, checking into hotels, even frolicking on a beach during what was supposed to be his business trip. Meanwhile, I was at home, obliviously doting on our teenage son Jason and managing the household. But it was the financial records that enraged me the most. Derek had been siphoning money from our joint accounts, setting up a separate slush fund to bankroll his tawdry affair. Tiffany's apartment, her car, her clothes, all paid for with my hard-earned money. The audacity of it all made my blood boil. As I pored over the documents, a cold determination overcame me. Derek's deception ran deeper than I could have imagined, but now I held all the cards. He wanted to deceive and discard his family for some cheap thrill? Fine. I would make him pay a price he couldn't fathom. Gritting my teeth, I began methodically compiling the evidence. I would rain down hell on my cheating husband, stripping him of everything he valued, his job, his reputation, his finances. By the time I was done, Derek would be left with nothing but the ashes of his selfish misdeeds. Let the games begin. With a heavy heart and my mind spinning, I made the call to hire a private investigator. As much as the thought of Derek's betrayal sickened me, I needed concrete proof before taking any drastic actions. A few days later, the PI delivered, in spades. Not only did he uncover details of Derek's tawdry affair, but the true depths of his deception left me reeling. Mrs. Thompson, the investigator began solemnly, sliding a thick manila envelope across the table, I'm afraid the situation is much worse than we anticipated. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope and examined the contents. Along with photos of Derek and his mistress Tiffany canoodling intimately, there were bank statements, receipts, even a lease agreement. Your husband has been systematically embezzling funds from your joint accounts to support this woman and her child, the PI explained, his voice laced with disgust. He's been paying for their apartment, a car, clothes, vacations, you name it. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The sheer audacity of Derek's actions, the callous way he was frittering away our hard-earned money on this cheap fling, made me seethe with rage. That low-life bastard, I spat, using me like a personal ATM while he plays house with some two-bit tramp. The investigator cleared his throat awkwardly. That's not all, Mrs. Thompson. According to the paperwork, this Tiffany woman already has a child, a 4-year-old daughter. You're kidding me, I scoffed bitterly. So not only is he cheating and stealing, but he's playing daddy to another woman's kid too? How cliché can you get? As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from Derek, that familiar pit forming in my stomach. Hey babe, running late at the office again tonight. Don't wait up. I wanted to vomit at his casual lies and saccharine attempt at affection. Meanwhile, he was likely off whining and dining his mistress with the money I helped earn through years of hard work and sacrifice. Gripping the damning evidence tightly, I turned to the investigator with a steely resolve. This has gone far enough. I want you to keep digging, every last filthy detail. The more ammunition I have, the better. The PI nodded grimly. You got it, Mrs. Thompson. I'll leave no stone unturned. That smug, lying snake was about to learn a brutal lesson. If Derek thought I would just roll over and let him trample all over me, he was sorely mistaken. When I was done with him, he wouldn't have a penny or a shred of dignity left. One way or another, he would pay for this unforgivable betrayal. I stormed into the house, the evidence of Derek's betrayal clutched tightly in my hands. My mind was racing, caught in a whirlwind of anger, disgust, and hurt. How could the man I loved, the father of my child, be capable of such depravity? Derek was lounging on the couch, casually flipping through channels. His eyes widened slightly as I marched over and slammed the file down on the coffee table. "What's all this?" he asked with a nervous chuckle. "Don't play dumb with me," I snarled, fury dripping from my voice. "I know everything, you lying, cheating snake." His face paled as he rifled through the photos and documents, the proof of his infidelity laid bare. Derek opened and closed his mouth like a gasping fish, struggling to formulate an excuse. "Ava, I can explain." "Explain what?" I shouted, throwing my hands up in exasperation. "How you've been stupping some cheap hussy behind my back, or how about embezzling thousands from our accounts to keep your little side piece living in luxury?" Derek's shoulders slumped in defeat. "I'm so sorry. It was a mistake, a lapse in judgment, but I still love you. You have to believe me." I barked out a harsh, mirthless laugh. "Wow, you really are delusional. Did you honestly think I'd be stupid enough to fall for your pathetic lies?" "Mom? Dad?" A small voice rang out. I whipped around to see our 16-year-old son Jason standing in the doorway, eyes wide with shock and confusion. "Jason, I didn't want you to find out this way," I began, my voice cracking with emotion. But the kid just shook his head sadly. "I already knew," he mumbled, not meeting my gaze. "I saw the text from Tiffany on Dad's phone a few months ago." The bottom dropped out of my stomach as I turned back to Derek, equal parts disgusted and heartbroken. "You're even more reprehensible than I thought, keeping this from your own son." Derek hung his head in shame, unable to offer any defense. I could feel the white-hot rage bubbling up again, threatening to boil over. Snatching up the file, I jabbed a finger squarely at my husband's chest. "Don't worry, this isn't over. Not by a long shot. I'm taking you for everything you're worth, you pathetic, disloyal scumbag." With that, I spun on my heel and stormed out, Jason trailing silently behind me. Derek made a feeble attempt to call after us, but I shut him out. He had shattered my trust into a million pieces, and there would be no putting it back together. From that moment on, the gloves were off. I would dismantle Derek's life, piece by piece, until he was left with nothing, no money, no reputation, no family. It was the only way to avenge this unforgivable treachery. After all, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of pent-up anger and meticulous planning. Derek's sniveling apologies and hollow promises fell on deaf ears. I was done being the fool. After his outrageous betrayal, there would be no forgiveness, no second chances. He had lit the fuse, and I was determined to watch his world burn. My first order of business was consulting a high-powered divorce attorney. Marlene Wilkins came highly recommended, a renowned legal pit bull with a reputation for taking no prisoners. "Mrs. Thompson, I've looked over the evidence you provided," she began, her voice all business. "Infidelity, embezzlement, emotional distress, you've got more than enough grounds for a very advantageous settlement." A feral smile crept across my lips. Music to my ears. "Good. I want everything. The house, full custody of Jason, alimony up the wazoo. I'm going to bleed that lying sack of crap dry." Marlene's lips curled in an approving smirk. "Consider it done. We'll bury him under an avalanche of litigation, take every penny he's worth." With the divorce proceedings officially set in motion, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but the end result would be oh so sweet. Derek left destitute and disgraced, finally reaping what he deserved. Of course, he still tried in vain to plead his case, as delusional as ever. "Ava, please, let's just sit down and talk about this," he begged one evening, trailing me to the kitchen. "I never meant to hurt you, I swear." I simply shook my head and laughed in his face. "You're still lying through your teeth even now. It's pathetic, really." Grabbing a knife from the butcher block, I began slicing an apple with slow, deliberate strokes, never breaking eye contact. "I'm going to take everything from you, Derek. The house, the money, my last name, all of it. And I'm going to savor every second of watching you lose it all." His eyes widened in fear and panic as the weight of my words sank in. Good, he was finally getting the picture. You can't do this," he sputtered frantically. Leaning across the counter, I held the knife aloft, watching his Adam's apple bob with a gulp. "Watch me." With that final warning, I brushed past him, leaving Derek to stew in the realization that his life as he knew it was over. The man who thought he could have his cake and eat it too was about to choke on a hefty slice of karma, served up piping hot. I would emerge from this divorce victorious, with my son, my dignity, and my sanity intact. Derek, on the other hand, would soon be left with nothing but the ashes of his selfish misdeeds. It was only fair, considering how thoroughly he had burned me. An eye for an eye, as they say. And in this case I planned to leave him blind. With the divorce proceedings underway, I knew I needed to land one final, decisive blow to completely dismantle Derek's life. Simply taking his money and assets wasn't enough. I craved the ultimate revenge of stripping him of his career and reputation, too. That's when I remembered the embezzlement evidence the private investigator had uncovered. Derek had been siphoning funds from our joint accounts to bankroll his tawdry affair, but some of that ill-gotten money seemed to trace back to his workplace as well. If I could prove he was stealing from his employer, he'd be fired in disgrace. I spent weeks carefully compiling documentation, following the financial paper trail like a bloodhound. Reams of data, hidden transactions, shady accounting practices. It was all there, plain as day, if you knew where to look. Derek's greed and arrogance had blinded him, leaving an incriminating money trail a mile wide. Finally, I took the thick dossier of evidence to an old family friend, Peter Kozlowski. He was a no-nonsense corporate litigator who had helped my father's business out of many legal jams over the years. If anyone could ensure this case stuck, it was him. "Ava, this is quite the situation your bastard husband has gotten himself into," Peter muttered grimly, meticulously reviewing the files. "Embezzlement, fraud, misappropriation of funds. He could be looking at serious criminal charges, not just termination." A cold, satisfied smirk spread across my face. "Good, let's bury the lying snake." Peter raised an eyebrow but didn't protest my harsh words. After going through the details of Derek's reprehensible actions, he understood the depths of my anguish. Over the next few days, Peter worked his magic behind the scenes, compiling ironclad legal documents and briefing Derek's employers on the illicit financial activity. The whole insidious scheme started unraveling with just a few carefully placed tugs on the right threads. The weekend before the corporate bombshell was set to detonate, Derek had the audacity to approach me one last time with another feeble plea for forgiveness. "Ava, I've made mistakes. Horrible mistakes that I'll regret until the day I die," he started, eyes brimming with crocodile tears. "But you have to believe that I still love you, and I'll do anything to make this right." I simply stared at him in stony silence, unmoved by his pathetic display. When he reached out to take my hand, I pulled it away with a look of utter revulsion. "You're going to get exactly what you deserve," I said coldly, "and not one bit more or less." Derek's brow furrowed in confusion, but I had already turned and walked away, leaving him to wallow in desperate uncertainty. Let him stew and agonize over his impending downfall. It was no less than that snake deserved. By the end of the week, the axe would fall, and everything he'd so selfishly jeopardized would be ashes at his feet. I could hardly wait to savor the look of abject horror on his face. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than Derek could have imagined. I had orchestrated every lurid, agonizing detail to perfection. This would be a public flaying he'd never forget. It started at the quarterly corporate meeting, where the entire staff had gathered in the main conference room. Derek was his usual arrogant, oblivious self as he swaggered in, completely unaware of the bombshell that was about to detonate. I gave Peter a slight nod, and he stood up from the back of the room, clearing his throat loudly. "Excuse me, everyone. I have an urgent matter to address before we proceed," he announced, his baritone voice commanding the room's attention. Derek's brow furrowed in confusion as Peter began pulling out documents and projecting damning financial records onto the screen behind him. "It appears we have a serious issue of corporate fraud and embezzlement of funds that has been uncovered," Peter stated grimly, "perpetrated by none other than our own Derek Thompson." A hush fell over the room as all eyes turned to Derek, whose face had drained of color. He shot me a panicked look, realization dawning that I had been the architect of his downfall. "What is this? Some kind of mistake?" he sputtered, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Peter shook his head firmly. "I'm afraid not, Mr. Thompson. The evidence is comprehensive and irrefutable. You've been caught red-handed stealing from this company to fund your illicit affair." With a few taps on his tablet, Peter pulled up the photos from the private investigator, leaving nothing to the imagination. Incriminating images of Derek cavorting with his mistress, receipts for luxury hotels and expenses, all paid with embezzled funds. Audible gasps echoed through the room as Derek's seedy transgressions played out in full view of his coworkers and superiors. His jaw worked furiously, struggling to formulate a denial, but no words came out. I couldn't resist twisting the knife a little deeper. "Sorry, dear, but I believe the jig is up," I called out loudly, making sure all eyes were on the disgraced adulterer. "Your lies and deceptions have finally caught up to you." Derek's face contorted in rage and humiliation as he opened his mouth to hurl some retort, but Peter cut him off sharply. "I wouldn't say another word if I were you," the lawyer warned. "In light of these findings, you're being terminated from your position effective immediately. Furthermore, we'll be pursuing criminal charges for your reprehensible actions." As if on cue, two burly security guards appeared to flank Derek, whose shoulders slumped in defeat. He shot me one last venomous glare, anger and hatred burning in his eyes. But I simply crossed my arms and smirked, refusing to let him rattle me. After the unforgivable way he had shattered our family, Derek deserved to be publicly crucified, and then some. As the guards led the disgraced charlatan away, the room erupted in hushed murmurs and utterances of disbelief. But I sat back with a satisfied smile, basking in the scorched aftermath of my revenge. Derek's professional life was over, his finances were ruined, and soon his entire world would be ashes at his feet, a well-deserved penance for his multitude of sins. I had promised him a brutally karmic downfall, and I had delivered in spectacular fashion. The lying, cheating snake had finally reaped what he'd sown. With Derek's career in ashes and his crimes exposed, all that remained was to finalize our divorce and ensure I emerged the decisive victor. My shattered trust and broken heart demanded complete and utter vengeance. The proceedings were a legal bloodbath, with Marlene, the merciless litigator, leading the charge against Derek's feeble defense team. I sat stoically as they attempted to gaslight me, cast aspersions on my character, even accuse me of fabricating evidence, anything to avoid taking responsibility for his reprehensible actions. "Your Honor, my client's transgressions, while regrettable, do not warrant such a lopsided and vindictive division of assets," Derek's mealy-mouthed lawyer protested. "We ask that you consider a more equitable settlement." I couldn't resist scoffing loudly as Marlene rose to her feet, a predatory gleam in her eye. "With all due respect, you've got to be joking," she stated flatly. "Mr. Thompson's egregious behavior goes far beyond simple transgressions. He lied, cheated, stole, and then compounded his sins by embezzling from his employer in a craven attempt to cover his tracks." Marlene turned to face the judge, a grim set to her jaw. "Your Honor, we have reams of ironclad proof detailing Mr. Thompson's moral depravity and criminal misconduct. The evidence shows a long pattern of deceit, manipulation, and downright sociopathic behavior. He has forfeited any right to an equitable split." You could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom as Marlene locked eyes with the miserable, broken husk that was my soon-to-be ex-husband. "My client demands and deserves to receive everything: the house, sole custody of their son, alimony, assets, the whole 9 yards. And Mr. Thompson is fortunate we aren't pursuing criminal charges for his reprehensible actions." Derek's head slumped into his hands, finally understanding the gravity of his predicament. He had gambled everything for a cheap fling, and now he was crashing face first into the brutal consequences. The judge eyed him with a mixture of pity and disgust before rapping his gavel firmly. "In light of the overwhelming evidence, I am ruling in favor of Mrs. Thompson's demands. Mr. Thompson will be stripped of all assets, surrendering the family home, primary custody of their son, and ordered to pay substantial alimony and legal fees. Furthermore—" I barely heard the rest, too busy drinking in the exquisite look of anguish and despair etched across Derek's crestfallen face. This was the moment I had fantasized about for months. The lying, cheating snake getting his karmic comeuppance in spectacular fashion. As we rose from our seats, Derek finally met my gaze, his eyes brimming with impotent rage and hatred. For a fleeting second, I wondered if he might lash out, try to hurl insults or threats. Instead, he simply shook his head, the fight utterly extinguished from his demeanor. "I hope you're happy now," he muttered bitterly. "You've taken everything from me." A cold, triumphant smirk crept across my lips. "Believe me," I replied coolly, "I am." 1 year later, I could finally breathe easy again. The ugliness of Derek's betrayal and the scorched-earth divorce battle had faded into the rearview mirror. In its place was a profound sense of relief and newfound optimism for the future. As I sipped my morning coffee and gazed out over the backyard of the house I had fought so hard to keep, I felt a swell of satisfaction. The lawn was freshly mowed, the garden in full bloom, physical manifestations of putting the past behind me and nurturing new growth. "Morning, Mom," Jason called out as he ambled into the kitchen, that familiar teenage shuffle to his gait. "The usual for breakfast?" I smiled and ruffled his hair affectionately. "You know it, kiddo. Pancakes and bacon coming right up." As I busied myself at the stove, my mind inevitably drifted to Derek and where his life had spiraled. The information I'd gotten through back channels painted a grim, karmic picture. First, he had been fired from his cushy corporate job in the wake of the embezzlement scandal, left with no savings or income after the divorce. With nowhere left to turn, that arrogant snake had slithered back to his mistress Tiffany, begging for a place to stay. I could only imagine the smug satisfaction she must have felt, lording it over the man who had once showered her with ill-gotten gifts and cash. For a few months, she let Derek exist in that humiliating limbo, freeloading off her and doting on her daughter like the surrogate dad he'd played at being. But inevitably, even Tiffany's patience wore thin. Without his money and status, Derek's charm curdled into desperation and neediness. The last I heard, she'd finally kicked him out, his sorry carcass forced to crash on a friend's couch and rely on handouts. Poetic justice, if you ask me. The man who had sacrificed everything for his tawdry affair was now destitute and alone, reaping the rotten fruits of his selfish misdeeds. All those expensive gifts, lavish dates, the apartment he'd bankrolled, it had all amounted to a cruel facade, a house of lies that crumbled to dust. "You okay, Mom? You've got that look again." Jason's concerned voice snapped me out of my reverie. I forced a reassuring smile and set a heaping plate of pancakes down in front of him. "I'm fine, sweetie. Just feeling grateful for how far we've come, that's all." He nodded knowingly, all too aware of the harrowing road we'd traversed. But the darkness was behind us now, replaced by the warm glow of a bright new future. As I gazed at my son happily devouring his breakfast, I felt a surge of protective love and pride. Derek's unforgivable betrayal could never tarnish the bond between mother and son. If anything, it had made that sacred connection even fiercer, tempered like steel in the crucible of turmoil. My cheating ex-husband could rot for all I cared. Jason and I had each other, this house, our self-respect. Those were the only things that mattered anymore. I had promised Derek a complete and merciless revenge, and that vow had been satisfied. Now at long last I could close that ugly chapter and focus on basking in my hard-won victory. The lying snake had finally gotten his just desserts.